Okay, let's think about the sheer, mind-boggling scale of modern aviation for a second. We completely take for granted that we can just buckle into a metal tube and hurtle through the sky at 500 miles an hour. But getting to this point, yeah, it was absolutely not a smooth flight. It is a story defined by monumental, literally bet the company risks. And honestly, no single entity embodies this wild ride of massive booms, devastating busts, and just incredible gambles quite like Boeing.
10 million. That is the number of passengers who board flights across the globe every single day. And if that's not enough, add to that $17.5 billion worth of goods flown daily. Global aviation is this invisible pillar holding up the entire modern world. And for well over a century, one company has been fiercely wrestling to dominate those skies.
But, every giant has to start somewhere. So how exactly does a timber heir in Seattle end up building an aerospace empire? The founder, William Boeing, actually started out running a highly successful logging business on land he inherited around Lake Superior. But he wasn't just a lumber guy. He was a Yale-educated engineer, and he used those timber profits to fund a very expensive, very specific obsession: the brand new, slightly crazy world of flying machines.
Part 1. Birth of an Empire. To see how Boeing conquered the skies, we've got to go all the way back to a converted Seattle shipyard in 1914.
When William Boeing finally struck out on his own, he created what was called the Model C biplane. And what actually gave it the edge? It was a brilliantly simple engineering tweak. By tilting the wings just 2 degrees upward and positioning that upper wing just slightly forward of the lower one, the plane became unbelievably stable. It outperformed literally everything else on the market by a mile, and that immediately secured them a massive 50-plane order from the U.S. Navy right when the U.S. entered World War I in 1917.
But here's the thing about aviation. It is a highly volatile business. When World War I ended, the military just instantly canceled its orders. And to make matters worse, the market was suddenly flooded with cheap surplus military planes, which completely wiped out any civilian demand. So what did Boeing do? He actually repurposed his Seattle factory to manufacture residential furniture out of local spruce wood. He even paid his idle workers wages straight out of his own pocket just to keep his highly skilled team together until new military contracts finally started trickling back in.
Part 2. Monopolies and breakups. The 1920s brought this massive commercial aviation boom, and Boeing was perfectly positioned to pounce on the airmail business.
By 1933, they had made this staggering technological leap with the Boeing 247. This was arguably the world's very first truly modern airliner. We're talking variable pitch propellers, wing deicers, and even a fully functional autopilot. It was light years ahead of anything else in the sky. But Boeing made a huge and frankly arrogant misstep. They flat out refused to sell it to anyone else, reserving the first 60 planes exclusively for their own newly formed airline.
So, what happens when you build a near monopoly? The government steps in. In 1934, Congress passed the Airmail Act to strictly crack down on aviation holding companies. The government forcibly fractured Boeing's empire into 3 completely separate entities. United Airlines took over the transport side, United Aircraft took Eastern manufacturing, and Boeing was left holding just the Western manufacturing arm. William Boeing was so devastated by the government smashing his life's work that he completely sold off his entire stake, rage-quit the whole industry, and retired to breed thoroughbred horses.
Part 3. The Flying Fortresses. Having lost their commercial crown, Boeing realized they needed to pivot, and they needed to think much, much bigger. 12,000. That is the jaw-dropping number of B-17 Flying Fortresses that Boeing pumped out during World War II. This aircraft was an absolute leviathan for its time. It carried an 8,000-pound payload of bombs and absolutely bristled with machine guns. Pumping out hundreds of these massive bombers every single month essentially saved the company from ruin and cemented Boeing's new reputation as the ultimate master of heavy-duty aircraft.
But they didn't totally abandon commercial innovation during the war buildup either. Enter the 1940 Boeing 307 Stratoliner. While most passenger planes back then had to fly super low to avoid oxygen deprivation, which often forced them to fly directly through terrible weather, the Stratoliner was the very first commercial aircraft with a pressurized cabin. This meant it could cruise at a then unheard-of altitude of 20,000 feet, soaring safely and comfortably way above the storms.
And then the war ended. Talk about a whiplash. The brutal reality of peacetime economics hit Boeing like a brick wall. During the war, their workforce had ballooned to 78,000 employees.
with sales hitting an all-time high of $421 million. But just 1 year later, sales plummeted to a mere $13 million. Boeing was forced to lay off almost 70,000 workers. It was the second major, agonizing bust in the company's roller coaster history.
Part 4. The Jet Age Gamble. The 1950s Cold War era brought a completely new existential threat, forcing Boeing to look far beyond traditional airplanes.
Meet the LGM-30 Minuteman. Now this wasn't a plane, it was a land-based intercontinental ballistic missile. To put its sheer destructive power into perspective, a single Minuteman could deliver a nuclear payload roughly equal to leveling the entire island of Manhattan. This steady, reliable stream of incredibly high-stakes military defense contracts became the exact financial backbone Boeing desperately needed.
Because they were about to take the biggest risk in their entire history, $16 million. Back then, that was 25% of the entire company's net worth. Boeing dumped all of this capital into adapting their military swept-wing jet designs to create a purely commercial jet, the Boeing 707. It was an absolutely massive bet-the-company gamble, especially when you consider that most commercial airport runways at the time weren't even long enough to handle a jet airliner yet.
But, as we know, the gamble paid off, ushering in the golden age of jet travel, which naturally led to this absolute icon, the Boeing 747. This was Boeing's first wide-body jet airliner, a total behemoth with a double-deck configuration seating over 400 passengers. Creating this completely revolutionized global travel, but man, it required a grueling R&D push. Engineers were working 10-hour days, 7 days a week, sometimes even going without paychecks, just to build a plane that initially cost a staggering $24 million per unit.
Part 5. Surviving the Bust. Because right after launching their revolutionary jet, the global economy completely tanked.
The 1973 oil crisis basically flipped the aviation industry on its head overnight, quadrupling the cost of jet fuel. Suddenly, airlines just couldn't afford to fly these massive, thirsty new 747s. For an agonizing 18 months, Boeing received exactly 0 new orders. 0. The despair in Seattle was just palpable. Boeing laid off 43,000 employees while simultaneously trying to fight off rising competition from a brand new European rival, Airbus. The economic devastation to the local community was so severe that 2 real estate agents famously put up a billboard capturing the grim mood of the 70s. It simply read, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?"
So, how on earth do you survive that? Well, they kept the lights on by scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel. Their steadfast military contracts for intercontinental ballistic missiles provided really the only steady income. But to avoid total bankruptcy, this titan of the skies actually resorted to manufacturing completely obscure civil transit products. We're talking building hydrofoils and even light rail vehicles for cities like San Francisco and Boston. It barely kept them afloat until the economy finally recovered in the 1980s. Part 6. The Second Space Race. Stepping into the 21st century, the legacy giant faces an entirely different breed of competition. Take a look at the recent International Space Station supply run contracts. Boeing is the ultimate legacy contractor, right? They were the first contractor for the ISS and built most of its US modules. Yet, they've only secured 2 of the upcoming cargo missions. Contrast that with SpaceX, the agile, disruptive newcomer utilizing reusable rockets, who has secured 7. The great pioneer of the skies is literally being outpaced by a 21st century startup.
And that gap? It gets even wider when we look at the insanely high-stakes race to actually carry astronauts. On paper, it's a showdown between 2 aerospace heavyweights. But in reality, Boeing's Starliner capsule has been plagued by ongoing development issues and delays. Meanwhile, SpaceX's Dragon 2 is already fully operational and successfully flying to orbit. The legacy titan is undeniably falling behind in the exact race they helped create.
Which really leaves us with one massive looming question to wrap this explainer up. Boeing's entire century-long history is defined by taking massive bets, surviving crushing busts, and engineering their way out of seemingly impossible corners. But with agile billionaires rewriting the rules of spaceflight and fierce foreign rivals like Airbus aggressively competing in commercial aviation, can the titan of the 20th century actually survive the 21st? It's a fascinating question, and one that is absolutely going to define the future of how we travel, both across